Hello, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us today for Top Sleep Medicine Trends of 2022. I know we have some people still logging in, but we have a lot to cover, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm Cindy Braden. I'm the SVP of Sales for Enzo Data, and I am joined by three esteemed experts in sleep medicine, which we are really appreciative of them taking time to discuss this all-important topic. Before we start and I introduce my guests, I do want to ask a quick poll. Curious to see what challenges for 2022 that you are most concerned about in sleep medicine. I mean, what a year 2021 was. But our next webinar, actually, we're going to be diving into some research that we've seen on the things that people are concerned about. So we're curious, since we have you all here, to see what you guys think. So we're at 30% voting, so get those votes in quick, and then we will just dive in. I will share them as well, so everybody can see what everybody else is thinking. Okay, perfect. Give it another 5 seconds. I'll actually read them because I know staffing, reimbursement, getting those patients the treated CPAP, keeping up with patient expectations, and IDLAB. You can pick more than one, I believe, as well. All right, let's see what you guys have. Oh, CPAP, not surprising. So before we get started on the webinar, I do want to introduce our guest panelists today. Dr. Seema Khosla is Medical Director of North Dakota Center for Sleep. She is a fellow of the College of Chest Physicians as well as the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. She completed her internal medicine residency at the University of Kentucky and her fellowship in pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine at the Medical College of Georgia. Dr. Khosla is active within the AASM and has served on numerous AASM committees, including the original telemedicine task force. She served as the inaugural chair of the Clinical and Consumer Sleep Technology Committee and is the current chair for the new AASM Public Awareness Advisory Committee. Dr. Khosla also serves as the medical director for MedBridge Healthcare and is the host of AASM podcast Talking Sleep. I know, one of our favorites and one of mine for sure. Dr. Maryann Deak is medical director of the sleep program at eviCore Healthcare and chair of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine's Emerging Technology Committee. Dr. Deak graduated from Georgetown University School of Medicine and completed her internship in internal medicine at Yale University. She completed her neurology residency at New York University School of Medicine and University of Massachusetts School of Medicine, where she also served as chief resident. Dr. Deak subsequently completed a clinical and research fellowship in sleep medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. And prior to coming to eviCore, Dr. Deak served as academic faculty in the Division of Sleep and Circadian Disorders, Departments of Neurology and Internal Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital for Harvard Medical School. And she also served as a medical expert for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration since 2016. Dr. Deak is board certified in neurology and sleep and currently serves as the chair of the Medical Advisory Committee at eviCore Healthcare. She is a sleep medicine subject matter expert for sleep-related projects across Evernorth and Cigna Corporation and has served on several American Academy of Sleep Medicine committees and received awards and honors for that work and published numerous peer-reviewed articles. Robert Miller is Vice President of Sleep Business at Apria and has been a staunch advocate of sleep medicine for more than 20 years, with a unique clinical focus on both sales and operations. Credentialed both as an RPSGT and RST, Robert is actively involved locally and nationally with various sleep associations and serves as the president of the Carolina Sleep Society. Prior to joining Apria, Robert was Senior Vice President of Operations and Business Development with MedBridge Healthcare and also served as Senior Clinical Sales Specialist for Philips Respironics. Robert also served as the National Director of Sleep Services for Medcath Partners. Robert began his career in sleep medicine at Carolina's Medical Center before being hired by Presbyterian Hospital to lead a multi-site 24-bed sleep operation. He also founded and developed the curriculum for sleep technology at Central Piedmont Community College. The format of today's webinar as we jump in, and thank you again for joining us. Oh, let me get the for the webinar for our panelists and everybody attending. We do want this to be an open dialogue. We have such great experience and vast knowledge on things that are happening in the sleep world and the trends as they're coming in for 2022 that we really want to present an opportunity for these three guests to just dive into the topics that everybody is thinking about. So I'm going to present a question and then we're going to let them share their thoughts and insights on where things are. Before we dive into trends of 2022, we thought a really relevant question would be to look back on 2021 at some of the biggest challenges. Obviously, it was a challenging year in general, but particularly in sleep, we had quite the year. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Deak, if you don't mind diving into your thoughts on some of the biggest challenges in 2021.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cindy. Well, I think the poll results really are really indicative that you know, the Philips recall and the COVID-related supply chain issues and just the overall shortage of PAP machines, which was a major challenge and probably kind of first and foremost on our list of challenges for 2021. I think a lot of sleep practices and sleep labs had staffing challenges related to COVID-19. There were care delivery logistics challenges related to the pandemic. And overall, there's been an increase in mental health disorders among patients and even staff. And I think all of those things due to kind of the lengthy ongoing pandemic, as well as these additional challenges, came to a head in 2021. So I think I would start there and see what Dr. Khosla and Robert have to add to that.
You know, it was just this confluence of factors, wasn't it? That we are just thinking that we're getting out of the pandemic and then we're hit with this recall, you know, and I think it's been tough on us as, you know, clinicians, but certainly our patients. You know, I think it's been really hard. You know, they had to adjust to telemedicine, they had to adjust to more HSAT over PSG. And this whole time our message has been, it's really, really important to identify, diagnose, and treat your sleep apnea. And then all of a sudden, our, you know, most prominent method of treating sleep apnea has really been challenged by this recall. And it's really hard to get patients on CPAP. And I think that's been really challenging for us, but especially for our patients. You know, we sort of drop this and say, okay, well, this is the disorder. And now we don't have a straight shot at treatment. It's either, you know, an oral appliance or maybe hypoglossal nerve stimulation. And our main pathway to CPAP, I think, has been really challenged by this recall. Robert, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, you know, I think, you know, life in general is a little bit more difficult for everyone. And but I think there is a unique opportunity as it relates to sleep and sort of, and specifically mental health, because there's been a lot of, you know, I would guess information and new studies that are out there related to patients and or people who are having issues with sleep. And so there's a lot of focus on our field right now. All of those things combined with reimbursement cuts and, you know, these new methods of care delivery, there's just a lot of disruption that's out there. So all of us are sort of trying to navigate, you know, this new world that we have. And it's, I'm not sure that we found our way completely, but, you know, it feels like that we definitely are moving in a different direction from, you know, some of the things that we've sort of historically done and how we've been able to connect with people, with patients, and even how we've been able to acquire patients. You know, patients in the past may have only come to a sleep center because a physician, you know, saw the patient and recommended that they have a sleep study, where today it's that people are proactive about, you know, what their sleep quality is.
And when you think of this idea of coronasomnia and how that sort of fits in with our idea of psychophysiological insomnia, where there's kind of an inciting event or stress, and then you know, the whatever adaptive behaviors that patients have done turns that into a more long-term problem. Well, I think in this case, you know, just kind of in keeping with what Robert was saying, we also have just a chronic stressor of the pandemic, and I think that has a very real impact both on patients and physicians and staff and everybody involved. So, you know, I think all of that has kind of accumulated over the past couple of years.
I think that's such great points. And I think it leads right into the next topic that was kicked off at us on patient expectations. As the world changes, and I know you mentioned, you know, right when you think you have something figured out, kind of another curveball came in. And Robert, as you said, our patients are going through all of that as well. So if we maybe quickly want to talk about, I know just the consumerism and everything at your fingertips and results of COVID. There's so many things that that patients are expecting. So if you want to briefly speak about, you know, how have patient expectations changed this past year? Dr. Khosla?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was necessarily this last year, but I think we've seen this trend towards people expecting instant answers, right? On every website, there's a FAQ section. And so people are used to that. And the reality is that sleep disorders do take longer, right? It takes a while. It takes a while to see if it's just, let's say, sleep apnea or is there something else, right? That all takes a while.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that just with all of the changes in care delivery, there's openness to different models of care delivery, and there's also kind of an increased stress on convenience for the patient, on care at home. And I think there's also sort of a shift in attitude where, you know, based on having to deal with certain things on their own when medical care wasn't as readily available, that people are kind of seeking their own answers, but then are coming to their physicians with some of these answers that they may not understand. So they might be kind of looking to their wearable or, you know, their watch, or to try to give them some of the answers, and then having the expectation that their physician will review that with them or will be able to interpret that for them. So I think that while that trend was there prior to the pandemic, I think it's been kind of increased during the pandemic, and there's that increased interest in, you know, remote data monitoring and remote diagnostics, et cetera.
You know, I think that also in the world of a high deductible healthcare plan, that, you know, we have patients who are proactively seeking lower cost options. They may have world-class sleep medicine right down the road from their home, but because there's a significant out-of-pocket expense, they're going online, they're doing research, they're finding alternative routes to getting diagnosed and getting treated. So I think we have a little bit more of an educated patient in some regards, but it's out of necessity and financial necessity more so than necessarily trying to find who's the best sleep doctor in my hometown.
Right, they truly become these healthcare consumers, haven't they? Right, and I think they've done a lot of their homework ahead of time, so they already know about sleep hygiene and they already know these things, right? They're coming to a clinician because they need something more.
Absolutely.
Such great points. As you can see, I slid right into the next slide on the challenges of meeting these expectations of coming into the patients are coming in. So with that, the next topic that we thought is on everybody's mind are devices. There's new devices and new technologies that are emerging. Obviously, telemedicine was a big deal starting in 2020 and carrying all the way through with 2022. So what devices or new technologies do you see? I know there's lots already emerging, but that you see continuing to emerge or that you're expecting in 2022?
Maryann, this sounds like a good question for you.
I was going to say thanks.
Well, I mean, I think this is a big question, right? I mean, there's lots of technology. It's sort of hard to capture, both in the, you know, in the consumer space and the clinical space. You know, I mean, we're seeing lots of new technologies trying to provide treatment. We're seeing new diagnostic technologies. I think, you know, one sort of important distinction when you start thinking of technologies into the future for 2022 is, you know, how do we categorize these technologies? How do we understand them? And I think one of the challenges is that it's not so easy to understand them. They're not so evident where these technologies fall. You know, are these clinical technologies? Are these consumer technologies? And, you know, generally we try to define clinical technologies as those that require a prescription from a physician, and also are FDA cleared or approved. But what we've seen is the emergence of these different kinds of hybrid technologies. So you have technologies that have one channel, say, that is FDA cleared, and maybe it's just FDA cleared for heart rate, but not for oxygen saturation. But yet a claimed use of that device is the generation of AHI, for example. And so I think we're continuing to see sort of that line blur between consumer and clinical technologies. And there's also these sort of transitional technologies. So they have certain claimed uses and they're in the process of applying for FDA clearance, for example. So I think that's an increasing trend, and I think the onus is on you know, the provider community, the payers, the patients, all the stakeholders to try to understand, you know, what these technologies are, what are their great advantages, what are their limitations, so that we can be using them appropriately.
And I think you're right. I think that involves education of our patient, but also our colleagues, right? Because our patients deserve that conversation around expectations and this partnership, right, with clinicians to say, okay, this is what we can expect from this device, and this is what the data says. And I think it's really important that we're clear. You know, to your point, maybe the oximetry is FDA cleared, but the whole device is not. And that can be really difficult to untangle, you know, for the consumer, but even the clinician. And so I'm glad there are these resources that are available where you can go and look and help collect some of that information.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for leading into that. But we do have resources through the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. One of that is the hashtag sleep technology site. And essentially we have sort of a clear sort of algorithm for pieces of information that we think are valuable about different devices that we research and post there. And it's just an internal site. But it can be valuable for the clinician, especially to understand, you know, what are these devices, what evidence is out there to support their use, how are they intended to be used, are they FDA cleared or approved, and which aspects of the device are cleared or approved if they are, and what is their claimed use, and then what is the evidence to support what they're claiming to do or what they're purporting to do. So that's one of the goals of that, is to help, you know, a busy clinician doesn't have time to make heads or tails of all the technology, and it's a landscape that's constantly changing. It's really hard to keep up. And so one of the goals of that is to help provide resources and support for the provider community.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was actually going to say that, you know, sleep right now to me is the world of the technology startup. It seems like there are new companies that seem to be, you know, coming online all the time and bringing sort of a different spin on, you know, how patients might be diagnosed. In some cases, the devices are a little smaller. Some of the new technology that's out there, it's contact free. You know, it's the ability to diagnose and measure the different channels that we would like, you know, with a home sleep test without actually touching the patient. But I think that one of the things that will impact and change care is also the ability to communicate from a digital perspective with a patient post-diagnosis. And then, so you're almost tying the diagnostic into long-term care for a patient, or potentially sort of tying it all together so that you essentially make sleep become the front end of what should be chronic disease management for patients who have comorbid conditions over their lifetime.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that some of this technology allows us to collect longitudinal data, which we've never had, right? I mean, a PSG is a night or two in the lab, HSAT is, a night or two, but maybe this is really what helps us both engage patients and monitor patients. The other part that you've kind of hit on when you talked about consumerism is, we have this looming number of 80% of OSAs undiagnosed. And why? Is it because it's so cumbersome and fragmented to kind of go from A to B? And are these devices then going to sort of lower that entry threshold where people are more willing to evaluate their sleep? And then perhaps they are more willing to talk to somebody when their device tells them that there's something wrong with their sleep.
Well,
Yeah,
and I think, sorry,
go ahead, Robert. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and so that ability to be able to connect with a patient on a digital level, everyone for the most part has a smartphone. Everyone's looking at their phone every day. And we get different types of notifications and engagements from certain apps. Imagine if it becomes part of the health plan to treat a patient with sleep apnea, for instance, and then, there is regular engagement and it's sort of the patient, it's keeping them engaged, number one, but it's also proactive in that the patient would have access to data more regularly than just those first 1 or 2 nights.
Yeah, and I think this is already happening. Home health care has really taken off because there was a push for patients to be at home as much as possible, more so than in a facility or in the hospital. And those tools, those technological tools, can help accomplish that. I think it's also, it's longitudinal monitoring in the patient's home setting, which is different than if they came into the lab or something like that. But I think that's also one of the challenges of our field, is just the enormous amount of data to determine, what's valuable, how do we use it. And, it's, there was a recent article in JCSM about sort of like AI-driven symptomless OSA screening. So it's like, there's enormous amounts of data out there that could be, when you talk about the large population that's undiagnosed, how do we harness that? How do we determine who's at risk? How do we follow those patients over time? There's so many possibilities, but I think we also have to be really thoughtful about what the information means, what's the limitation of the information, how do we protect privacy, how do there's so many angles to this. It's really the challenge of being in medicine in this age, but it's also very exciting. I mean, the amount of things that we can do without having a patient in front of us, without having a patient go through a test in the hospital, there's just so many possibilities.
Well, and even kind of what you had touched on with, like Robert had mentioned, contactless sensors and so on and so forth. Will we get to a point where sleep is like another vital sign, right? In our hospitalized patients, will the ability to measure for, monitor respiratory rate and so on and so forth without contact, will that allow us to skip checking vitals on some patients and allow for better sleep consolidation in the hospital, therefore better healing, right? Will there be this general more awareness of the importance of sleep, right? That's the one thing that people all agree on. Hospitals are terrible places to sleep. And why is that, right? We're just not respectful of circadian rhythm. We're not respectful of routine. We're not respectful of any of this stuff. And yet we magically expect people to feel better.
I think one of the challenges that we do have from a data perspective is the fact that we have data in pockets for each individual patient. And there seems to be sort of walls. If you diagnose with one type of device, then that patient's information is going to be in that particular bank of data. If they're on a CPAP device, then their adherence data is in a different place. So data integration over the long term, I think, is going to be something that will be important as we look at a patient from a holistic standpoint.
Yeah, and I think, just looking what's on the screen here, HSATs, I think now that there's many more models of care and ways that care can be delivered, and more that are existing outside the physician's offices, outside the hospital, I think the challenge is also how do we triage, so to speak, in the same way, like who gets a home sleep apnea test, who gets a facility test, who has one and then the other. We have to think that same way about, what's the appropriate site of care for patients, what metrics are important, how do we determine who's appropriate for a telehealth following over the long term, who should really come into the office. I think there's a lot of, telehealth is ubiquitous and is very, I think is here to stay, but I think we have to start thinking about, how do we triage in a sense? How do we determine the best site of care for patients now that it feels like there's so many more options driven by technology?
So this is a good question. How has the increase in HSAT impacted treatment of patients? And so I think this sort of came from us focusing on the AHI as like the only thing that mattered with the PSG, right? And like our colleague Doug Kirsch would say, there are lots of cheaper ways to get that AHI. And so that's fine if we're looking for the AHI, but there's still this tons of data contained within EEG, right? And so are we going to shift from being OSA medicine and really kind of harness all of this EEG data? And is that going to help us, screen high-risk populations for Alzheimer's, when you see those early changes and that sort of thing? And so we've kind of diverged a little bit that, yes, HSAT has helped us get that AHI, but I still think that we need to address, well, what else, right? Because we're more than sleep apnea medicine. We have a lot more to offer our patients.
I think that's a great point, Seema. And I think, I think that the pandemic has also highlighted the importance of, treatment of insomnia and sort of, sleep health overall, independent of treatment of OSA or coincident with OSA. But I think, we've known that for a long time, that has impacts on mental health, on physical health, on many other metrics, and and we have to make sure that we're permitting equal focus on these other areas as well.
I do think that this certainly the increase in SHATs has provided for us as sleep clinicians. I think that we have to consider our patient journey a little bit differently as far as where the education takes place also, because when a patient goes to goes for an in-lab sleep study, there's a lot of direct interaction with the sleep tech who's educating them on the test, and then also about sleep apnea and what to expect sort of after the study, and maybe they've even seen their sleep medicine specialist beforehand to get some of that education. So I think we have to be careful with the home sleep apnea test to ensure that we are inserting appropriate patient education at the right time in the patient journey, so that there's a successful outcome for that patient, just as if there would be if they went sort of through a more traditional in-lab testing route.
We did get a question. I'm going to jump in here and we can discuss it a little more towards the end, because I know treatments is our next topic, and it's something that everybody with everything going on this year, how to treat these patients effectively is such a hot topic. So I want to get to it. But we did get a comment and a question about this, and you all touched on it and circled on the importance of, there's so much more to sleep medicine than just getting that AHI. And the question that came in, is how can AASM position with insurance companies? Like, let's face it, insurance companies probably prefer HSATs, and then the patient expectations are, why can't I just get this at home? Because they're not, like you just said, Robert, they're not aware of all of this other stuff that are part of sleep, and that we can gather data from sleep. So, is there a position for AASM, to work with insurance companies, education on these patients, all the comorbidities that are affected by sleep, because it seems like it's getting harder and harder to get a patient in the lab when you're working with the reimbursements of insurance as well as patient expectations. So I don't know if anybody has any additional thoughts on that, or anybody that's working with AASM, if that's, obviously it's something that you guys are concerned about and working with as well.
I can share. I had a peer-to-peer fairly recently, and I remember asking, sort of saying, well, this is what the ASM, it was about oral appliance therapy. I said,
Sure.
well, this is what the ASM recommends. And they flat out told me they don't care. They said, well, we listen to ASM, but we also listen to all these other ones. And she said out of 141 is what she quoted me, you know, and that's who they listened to.
Yeah.
It was very surprising to me.
Well, I mean, I think my comment would be that in general, from all stakeholders, including payers, that there needs to be a focus on the evidence and on, you know, evidence-based, you know, guidelines and practice parameters, et cetera. And, you know, I think if we all focus there, then that's how we're going to get the best outcome, because there needs to be a focus on, you know, what is the value from the standpoint of how can we provide the best quality care for patients. So I think when payers are looking at things like EEG, you know, there needs to be some demonstrated value or benefit to the patient looking over the long term. And I think that's what the field has to demonstrate to make that more viable.
And maybe more collaboration than with other societies, right? If the insurance companies are listening to AADSM and ASM and a plethora of other societies, then maybe our messaging needs to be a little bit more consistent, right? Or maybe we all just work together towards a common goal.
Well, because ultimately we have to show a lower cost of care for a treated patient versus a patient who's untreated, and do it on a large scale, large enough that it makes the healthcare industry as a whole sort of stand up and take notice that, wait a minute, we know about this disease state. You know, it's sort of taking care of itself today, but really sort of collectively, you know, bring it to the front and understand that a patient with sleep apnea is going to cost the system more. They're going to have a lower quality of life if they're not treated. You know, so all of those things into account. So it's sort of data and value, you know, together to prove a good outcome.
Which brings it back to what Maryann was saying, right, about needing the data and, you know, demonstrating. I think that AHRQ report really kind of shone a light on the paucity of data that we have, and maybe we do need to do a better job with research and really proving our worth, right?
Yeah. And it's also thinking about, you know, what metrics are important and ensuring that we include all the metrics that are important, you know, to patients, including things like sleepiness, including things like risk of accidents, you know, which obviously impact the outcome for patients as well as, you know, the costs of care. So we have to think of all of those things.
Perfect segment, because treatment and getting these patients taken care of this year was probably one of the greatest challenges. Well, we saw it, that people are even concerned about for 2022 and what we experienced in 2021. So, you know, looking at all of the options that are out there, what are some of the new treatments that you see emerging or existing treatments that might grow or advance in 2022, and how it'll impact those patient outcomes, and, you know, bring awareness to all of the benefits. Let Robert, like you said, of like financial, healthier patients who are taken care of by sleep medicine are healthier patients. So not only is it a win for the patient, it's a win for healthcare because it's much less expensive. So what do we see on treatments for 2022 and emerging trends here?
And let me add one more thing, and more importantly, the patients will actually use it.
What a great point. I should put an asterisk on this slide. Yes.
I mean, this is a great question, right? And I think we've paid a lot more attention to non-PAP options since the recall. You know, I know it's a conversation that we've had, you know, for years and years and years, but it just seems like it's more urgent, right? That we are comfortable with non-PAP options. We're comfortable with, you know, maybe thinking about medication to treat sleep apnea. I think Robert has talked about that in the past, that, you know, maybe it's a hybrid approach, maybe low dose CPAP, maybe it's a nasal EPAP, maybe it's a daytime stimulation device, right? But for us to kind of move away from that knee jerk, everybody gets on CPAP first, right? And as we've already highlighted, some of the challenges will be insurance covering that and insurance agreeing, right? Because the potential of moving somebody into a dental device is, you know, upfront probably more expensive, right, than a CPAP, especially if they don't actually wear it, to Robert's point.
Yeah, and I think it also gets to that question of the evidence and needing to catch up with the need. You know, right now, I think the need for more alternative, equally effective treatments is greater than the evidence to support those alternative treatments. So I feel like we need to play some catch up there so that we have more in our toolbox, you know, to offer patients that can impact, you know, long-term metrics as much as CPAP.
So I'm going to go a little bit technology in my response, and it's that, you know, I believe that what I would love to see is the use of more artificial intelligence on the front end to create sort of a precision medicine approach to treatment for patients, taking into account multiple, issues that a patient has that might be barriers for them for certain types of treatment, where other paths of treatment might be a better option for that particular patient.
I think that personalized medicine is huge,
Yes.
right? And maybe it is, you know, maybe it's a anthropomorphic measurement. Maybe it's discussing, you know, everything's on the table. What do we talk about first? And oh, I think you'd be a great candidate for this and a great candidate for that. And is it algorithmic? Is it? And I think that's really where that shared decision making is so important, right? You can look at somebody and say, oh, you would do really, really well, I think, with a dental device. And they're like, no, I would gag. I don't want to do that, right? It's really important to have that personalization and that communication. Yeah.
I was just going to say, absolutely. You know, sleep medicine, like every other field, struggles with, you know, patients being able to use the treatments that we're prescribing or being able to consistently use the treatments that are being prescribed. And so, you know, it definitely needs to be, you know, decisions that are made in concert with the patient, because if they're not going to use whatever, it could be the best treatment in the world, but if they're not able to comply with it, then it's not really helping. So that's the other piece as well.
I think we would have to see payer policy change just a bit, though, because in a lot of cases it's sort of a try this, and if it fails, then you can move to the next step, where it may be an approach that allows for sort of an open-ended, you know, number of treatments for a particular patient, so that at least you have a pathway that you can take that you're engaged with as a patient.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the policies can vary based on, you know, what the evidence shows, right? And what, you know, what's the severity of the patient. If we're talking about OSA, you know, what's the severity of their OSA? What are the patient's symptoms? You know, what's the evidence behind these various treatments? So I think in some instances, a stepped approach is appropriate based on some of those factors, but in other instances, it might not be. And so it's finding those evidence-based algorithms or ways of thinking about it that we ensure that we're not using sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to every scenario, but that it makes sense based on the evidence.
But at the same time, we need to reduce the barrier to entry for a lot of people too, right? Because if there's no coverage for, you know, whatever alternate non-PAP option, a lot of people just won't do it.
Such great points. All right, I know we discussed, yeah, I'm going to repeat again on the patients have to be adherent to what you're treating them with. So I think that's a great point to move on from the treatments. And I know we discussed a little bit already on wearables, but I know in particular we wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to discuss the difference between clinical and consumer. And, you know, I know one of the things just in general is, you know, trying to decide how to lean into things to get better outcomes for patients, and as you've said many times on the call, how to educate the difference between clinical and consumer. So just first question, you know, how might growth in wearable adoption and technology affect sleep medicine?
Well, I mean, I think as sleep clinicians, or really all stakeholders in the sleep field, we have to be open to technology. I mean, I think technology is ubiquitous. It's not always what we might be most comfortable with in a certain scenario, but we have to be open to it, and we have to understand it, at least broadly, and understand how you can use it, and use that as a means to communicate with patients, and understand what their concerns are. So even if they're using a device that may not be able to provide, clear metrics from a clinical standpoint, they're bringing that to you because they're trying to give you a message about what's going on with them, and that can be kind of harnessed and utilized to get to initiate those conversations and to determine what would be the appropriate next step for patients. So I think that kind of the first step is openness and understanding, and then the second step is also educating patients and utilizing that to to kind of as a jumping off point to the clinical relationship.
Do you find that a lot of patients present? And I guess I'm relating this to myself, that I've seen a lot of people that come in because of their wearable or what have you, and it detects something, and they may not necessarily understand what their sleep complaint even is. They just say, hey, mine is different than my friends, and why is that? And then you sort of have that conversation, right? So to your point, it's patient engagement, right? But maybe that has allowed people to be more aware and then do the next step, right? And see what's wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's where that education piece comes in, because it doesn't necessarily mean it's pathological, whatever they're seeing, but they're seeing something that's that they want to understand better. And so I think that's part of that education, determining when there could be something pathological, when a next step is warranted. Because not every patient that comes to a sleep clinic necessarily, needs sleep testing or needs, an intervention. But maybe the only intervention is education and understanding. So I think it's, I think there's a broader spectrum of the things that we might see, and they're getting information from all sides. So it's, so, I mean, I think that's why also, everyone needs to have a basic understanding of sleep technology, I mean, and things that, for example, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, but we're planning a montage segment to come out, in a few months. And one of the things we wanted to talk about was PPG technology. Now, I mean, PPG tech, it's not like, that like comes up in casual conversation that you're talking about PPG technology. But, I think that's a technology that's ubiquitous. It's in many devices, both consumer devices and clinical devices. There's differences in how PPG is done. There's differences in even the types of light that are utilized, and that can impact the outputs, and that can impact the accuracy. And it's it's helpful for all stakeholders, but clinicians also to have a basic understanding. Not all PPG is equivalent, and there's like so many different devices with different levels of evidence to support them that are utilizing quote unquote the same type of technology. So I think that's helpful to understand.
Although there is a blurred line between sort of some of the consumer devices that are out there and then the true diagnostic tools that we have. The good news is those consumer devices are helping to prepare our patients a little more for the actual night of diagnosis. Where with some of the devices you have to connect, Bluetooth to your phone and an app and all of those sort of things. So thank goodness for the consumer world, because I think it has helped prepare our patients, certainly for the night of testing.
Well, and I think it's almost bizarre how quickly we've become accustomed to constant monitoring. You know, like that's been completely normalized now that there's all kinds of metrics. You know, many people walk around every day with all kinds of metrics being recorded about them, and that's, I mean, when you think about, that's so different than even, you know, a few years ago. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's really kind of interesting, and has, I think, changed people's mindset overall and normalized that idea that, you know, of being electrophysiologic monitoring does not seem odd or unusual anymore.
And you kind of wonder then if people will get an understanding of what their normal is. So like the person that's really stressed out that they're not getting 8 hours of sleep a night may be a 6.5 hour sleeper and maybe totally functional, totally normal, right? And so that that ability to sort of understand your normal, I think might be helpful in terms of further discussion with the clinician, and not just sleep clinicians, right? But for all of healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I mean, we've all had those experiences where, you know, we try to treat a patient and they don't respond the way we expected, you know, to anything, a medication or another type of intervention. And I think it's just, I mean, you have to understand patients at the, you know, the group level and the larger level, but they're all individuals, and, you know, we're going to be constantly surprised that, you know, that people are going to react in their own way. They didn't read the textbook, their bodies didn't read the textbook or whatever it is, you know. So
the one thing that I hope, though, from a consumer and a clinical standpoint that that doesn't get blurred is reimbursement for providers, and the fact that these cheaper consumer technologies, while the technology is great and it's a tool, you know, from to be able to deliver a clinical diagnostic for a patient, you know, there's a lot that goes into that. And with some of the reimbursement cuts that have occurred, you know, even from Medicare over the last year, you know, I hope that they understand that there's a lot that has to take place to get that patient through that diagnosis, and maybe we'll see some of those numbers head in the other direction at some point.
Well, and it's a very significant diagnosis, right? Both to capture and to miss, right? The people that are reassured by, you know, maybe a false negative home device, you know, not an HSAT, but a consumer device, and maybe don't seek further evaluation. You know, I think just that education, like you were saying, Robert, that education with the patient so that you understand, you know, what it means. Like, remember the Owlet Smart Sock? People were using it to monitor their kids. It was a sock with oximeter, and the FDA said, no, this is a medical device, and they had to pull it from the market. You know, because people were making medical decisions based on a consumer device.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the education piece comes in. I mean, I think you're both absolutely right about that, is that, and that, you know, as I said, I think that that's something for all stakeholders, that there needs to be, even though the delineation is less clear in the sense that there are these kind of transitional or hybrid devices, we need to be clear on what, you know, what is the evidence to support what device X, Y, and Z is claiming to do, regardless of which aspect is FDA cleared, if it's just one aspect, or what they're applying to do. And I think that that's the point that needs to be clear. That and I think it's complicated. I mean, particularly for patients, they're not going to necessarily understand the distinction. And what, you know, I think most people think, you know, if the FDA is on there, then it's an okay device, you know, but I think that's where the education piece comes in. And I think that the provider community generally understands that, but maybe, you know, it's, as I said, hard to keep up with the nuances of all of these different devices. And that's where I think, the AASM plays an important role in providing those resources and that education to make that clear.
No, you're right. And that's such an important resource, I think. You know, the marketing's very slick, right? If something comes out and says FDA approved, FDA cleared, whatever, right? The marketing's very, very slick. So it's nice to have this, you know, third party kind of objective measure to look at the data and look at what is supported and compare those claimed uses to what actually is in them, especially when we're talking about black box, right? You know, some of these do have like an AI component. And, you know, do you trust what's in the black box, and do you trust the output? You know, if it's all opaque.
I did skip to the, Dr. Deak, you were talking about education, and I thought, oh, it's a perfect opportunity. You know, one of the things that I feel like I sit on both sides of the fence is, you know, I'm not great at embracing change, but I kind of get set in my ways on things, but I know how important it is, particularly in healthcare, to make sure that your, you know, technology changes and the ways that we can help patients change, you know, constantly, and that's a good thing, especially if we can free up time to talk to the patients, and education is so crucial. So I did skip ahead. We only have 2 topics left, was AI, and I know, Robert, you spoke on that a little earlier, so if we have time, we can go back to that. But I do want to talk about the changing roles in sleep, from the way, you know, where you guys are now, as you said, with peer-to-peer, you're advocating constantly across all the sleep professionals to understand the impact that sleep has with comorbidities, to the technicians that are treating patients and becoming sleep educators and that sort of thing. So I wanted to give you guys time to talk a little bit about the implications of those trends and how they're impacting sleep professionals across the board, and just the changing roles in sleep.
I know Robert has a background in technologist training, you know,
Yeah,
and his that. Yeah.
I was going to say, I'll speak to the sleep tech side of things. I know for me at least, you know, the first thing that I would say is we know that the patients who are coming into a sleep center now and in the future are going to be more acute. So making sure that we have the knowledge and the skills from a clinical perspective to be able to care for those patients who are potentially have comorbid conditions in addition to their sleep apnea. But more importantly, looking at the future also, you know, I would love to see, and I know that we all know the term sleep coach, but, you know, I almost would love to see it that a sleep tech is involved not only in the diagnosis for the patient, but becomes part of the adherent monitoring of a patient, and then becomes more of a health coach, you know, in the long term, where maybe some of the things are, some of the connections with the patient are sort of in digital form, but then also in science, and not necessarily medical recommendations, but sort of science recommendations just based on certain health conditions and information that's available, and understanding how to communicate it to the patient specifically, so that they can understand it and then adopt that, you know, whatever that particular recommendation is. So sleep to health coach is sort of what I'd love to see the sleep tech role evolve into.
Yeah, I mean, I think Seema mentioned earlier the idea of fragmentation of care, and I think that that's an important aspect of improving quality, is to have continuity in the sense that patients aren't trying to get care from all of these disconnected pieces, and that there's somebody either helping them to navigate that, or there's some element of the process that could be smoother, because I do think that is one of the challenges of our field, and I mean all other fields, frankly. But I think sleep is even more complex, because when you think of it, there's so many involved. You know, there's the testing piece, there's the DME piece, there's medications, a provider, the pharmacy. You know, there's this long-term monitoring aspect, even when they're on therapy. So, and there's lots of means of obtaining data, but, you know, who's following, how is the patient being supported? I think that's one of the areas that the field has really struggled with, and to have that continuity over the long term.
And I think people outside our field don't realize how valuable our sleep technologists are, right? It's more than putting leads on a patient. They are patient advocates. They educate our patients. They assuage those concerns when patients come in, because it's weird, right? You come into a sleep lab, it's weird. And they bond with our patients, right? They are there as their resource, their advocate, their liaison to the rest of the sleep, world. And I think people outside our field don't don't get that. They don't get how good our sleep technologists are and how educated they are and how knowledgeable they are in this field, right? And how they can really relate to patients one-on-one. You know, sometimes that's what makes a difference between somebody, you know, having sort of a negative attitude about coming in for a sleep study and then becoming really adherent to CPAP because of that conversation with the technologist that said, hey, you know what, I had to wake you up after 2 hours because your oxygen level went to whatever, right? And that bond, and then how they feel in the morning. You know, they're just an irreplaceable, invaluable resource.
As a sleep tech, I appreciate that comment very much.
I was gonna say I'm gonna pile on there, Robert, too, because I unfortunately a lot of events that are scheduled or were scheduled in 2021 were canceled, but I did have an opportunity to head to the BRPT and sit in on the conversations and the examples and the stories, and I even got to sit on trivia night. And it's, you know, as a potential patient and somebody who is clearly not a provider or a tech, it's really inspiring to hear the questions that they're talking about. And, you know, I'll put my mom, I have a 16-year-old son, my mom / life coach hat on, where I'm, you know, I'm constantly talking to him, you know, especially with everything going on in the world right now, you know, not to get too caught up in the details, but to really focus on the outcomes that you want. And I can tell you, it, you know, it's inspiring for me when I'm sitting in meetings like that and I'm hearing all of the focus on the outcomes, right? It's all about finding stuff that the patients will do, educating the patients on how important it is and getting them healthy. And just hearing all three of you guys focus on that, you know, anyway, as somebody in sleep but sits in the outside from the clinical role, it's really inspiring to hear you all so focused on, you know, embracing change in any way that you can to just get to the outcomes that you want, which is happy, healthy patients. So anyway, that's my little, my life coach hat there. All right, we are 2 minutes to the hour. I really appreciate the questions that came in. I did, as hopefully many of you that typed your questions, I was able to kind of phrase some of the questions that we were covering to get some of them covered as we went along, because I had a feeling we were going to run up right on to 2 o'clock with just listening to all of the wonderful input that were shared by our three guests. So I do want to thank everybody again so much, Dr. Khosla, Dr. Deak, and Robert, for spending time, your different perspectives, and then how incredibly involved you all are in sleep is really inspiring. I do want to remind everybody that there is a survey that will pop up. If you do want to watch this webinar again, we did record it, so it will be shared on our website. If you go to the EnsoData website, it does take about 2 days for us to process it and get it up. So feel free to head to the EnsoData website to watch the recording or share the recording. We also have a webinar in February that you can register for there as well. We won't have as exciting guests. It's just going to be me diving into some of the research that we found and some ways to really try to attack some of the challenges for 2022. So feel free to register there. And in the survey, give us any other suggestions of webinars that you might like to see us host in the future. So Dr. Khosla, Dr. Deak, Robert, thank you again so much for sharing your insights. And I hope everybody has a fantastic 2022. Let's get out there and make an impact for these patients. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks
so
for having
much.
us.
Bye.
Bye.